Welcome to Out of the Fold. According to a Pew Research study from 2017, in the world there are about 2.3 billion Christians, 1.8 billion Muslims, 1.2 billion unaffiliated, which includes atheists and agnostics, 1.1 billion Hindus, a half a billion Buddhists, 400 million people of folk religions, which are basically religions that aren't part of organized religion as a whole, 100 million people of self-identified other religions, and somewhere between 10 and 15 million Jews. To put this in perspective, Metallica's Black Album sold 15 million copies, so there may be more fans of Metallica in the world than there are Jews. Calling yourself Jewish can mean to follow the religion of Judaism based on the Torah, but it can also mean to have been born to a Jewish mother. Because of this, most Jewish families believe that Jews born to Jewish mothers are still Jewish even if they renounce their faith. My guest today is Isaac, who was born to a Jewish mother and raised in a yeshivish Jewish community, which could probably be safely thought of as a denomination or sect of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, but it is also a Jewish educational system. This episode is the first part of 3. No religious organizations, companies, or individuals were contacted for comment about any of the content of this episode. The views expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. Our conversation began on a Friday afternoon.
So I was raised in California. I'm not going to say exactly where, but it's important that I mention that it's California because there is a very big difference between being raised Orthodox Jewish in America. In the New York and New Jersey area is where the majority of Jews live. Anywhere outside of that area is considered by the Orthodox community to be out of town, sort of. So we're talking like there are a lot of Jewish Orthodox Jewish communities all over the United States. California has many. Chicago has many. Miami and Florida have many. They're definitely all over the place. But those, so to speak, out of town communities are often quite different than the way you would experience Orthodox Judaism in those central New York communities. I'll get a little bit more into that in a minute, but it's just important that I mention that I was raised in California. I was raised in a Orthodox Jewish family, and I was starting from the age of first grade all the way until senior year of high school. I was in the school system of it would be called the yeshivish school system, and like going to yeshivas. And what that means is Orthodox Judaism kind of encompasses many things. What it basically means is that you follow the Torah, which is the New Testament, the Old Testament. The Torah is word for word factual. Like every word was written by God. The words can never be changed. And everything that Orthodox Jews do is derived from the Torah. All the laws and all the halachas is what they're called, the halachot that Jews follow, are derived from the Torah by rabbis over the centuries. That's what Orthodox Judaism kind of encompasses. Now, within that, there are modern Orthodox Jews who kind of embrace the modern world and kind of maybe they'll keep Shabbos and maybe they'll keep kosher, but it's they won't go into the minutia of the details that may be sort of ideally required. Moving up from that, kind of past Orthodox Judaism to the more extreme side, we have like yeshivish and Hasidic people, of which there's also very distinct differences. And I think most people are kind of familiar with the Hasidic Jew, in popular culture. It's a pretty well-known thing, but the yeshivish is what it's called, is very different, and I want to get into that a little as well. So I went to a I would say definitely yeshivish school growing up, and what that means is um, the all the rabbis who are there are were pretty much raised on the East Coast and kind of came to Los Angeles almost to like spread that 70s and 80s yeshiva New York ideal like to other communities, which is fine. And but within these yeshivas, I would say it's kind of mm, like the fundamental focus is to study Torah.
Hmm.
The learning and like studying of the Talmud of the Torah that is uh, the it is portrayed and taught as to be the ultimate focus in life. Like the ideal goal of any yeshiva boy is to learn Torah as much as they possibly can.
Hmm.
Um, Now, I kind of had my own difficulties with it growing up. I was so a big part of being part of the yeshiva system, something that I kind of realized after I got out of it, is you kind of really need to really be a part of it from the top to bottom. That means like from the family, from everything. And for me personally, even though my parents decided to send me to this yeshiva for their own personal religious reasons, um, at our house, things were not, it was not a yeshivish house. A true yeshivish house would have absolutely no outside influences, no TV. There would be no TV in the house, no magazines, no secular magazines. There are Jewish magazines that are permitted. No, not even like library books. In many cases, would be like just not permitted. Like, why do you need to be reading those books? And again, it's absolutely on a spectrum, and it's even more of a spectrum when you're in a place like California, when there's many more different lifestyles and just people coming from a lot of different places. But even so, the schools themselves, um, they part of it. One of the things that they pride themselves on is maintaining that tradition and never deviating from it. Like we don't change things. We do things the way we've done things, and that does not change no matter what.
Right.
That is considered one of the most important things.
Hmm.
So so growing up, I always kind of had my own difficulties because I would say 90% of my class and growing up was pretty solid into that yeshivish culture. Like their families were all, they had older brothers who were studying, they're older and they're studying either in Israel or New York, and all their sisters get married really early and they all start having kids. Like, and their parents, they also went to these yeshivas, and they also they're very involved in the lifestyle. So my house is not exactly like that. Both my parents are religious, but they both of them grew up elsewhere, and they definitely did not grow up yeshivish. So there was a bit of a culture disconnect in my house, which
Hmm.
I struggled with absolutely. As in, like we had a TV in our house. We didn't really watch TV, but we had one. We play video games on it. We read secular books all the time. There definitely were lines drawn, which I started to find arbitrary. Like my parents wouldn't let me listen to any secular music, and I love music. And for a long time, I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. How come you can do this but not this? And my parents never really gave me any satisfactory answers. They're just like, because we're adults. I'm like, well, what does that have to do with Judaism? Like,
Right. Right.
the laws apply to everybody, adults and kids. Like there's no distinction on what you're allowed to listen to or watch. So that never really made sense to me.
Hmm.
Um, and so, but I would say it wasn't too bad. I was a kid without much cognition or understanding. I just was doing what I was told, and I wanted to make my parents happy, and I wanted to make my teachers happy, and I wanted to make my friends happy. So I studied the Torah, and the way it would work in most yeshivas, they run on a pretty similar system, and there is some deviation again, which I'll get into in a bit. But the one I went to, and again, this is elementary school. The way it works is the mornings are always dedicated to Torah study. So that means from 8 a.m. until 1 p.m. usually. It's nothing but studying Torah, studying the actual Torah. As you get older, you start getting into the commentaries, into like the Talmud and other more Rambam and Maimonides, different commentaries. And it's that is like really, really like there's a reason they do it in the morning. Like they want it to be the first thing, the most important thing. Like the Judaism is really what is pushed and expressed the most. Like this is the ideal of the world. Like, and like you're saving the world when you're learning this Torah. Like, and this is what's holding the world up. Um, so there's a lot of that, and then in the afternoon, you would have secular studies. Now again, it's on a huge spectrum of for how seriously these secular studies are taken. In the modern Orthodox communities, they're usually taken very seriously, and even though there still is this split, for the morning is for Torah studies and the afternoons are for secular. The secular studies are emphasized a lot, and it's considered an ideal to become like a doctor or a lawyer, you know, the old tropes. But it's still true. Like the ideal is to be very well educated, which is great for modern Orthodox, while still maintaining the sense of tradition. For the yeshivish, again, it's a spectrum, but many of them only do secular education because the law requires it. I would say the one I went to does not fall under that category specifically, like because the law requires it. Like they understand that there is obviously a benefit to being educated, but it is not the focus of the school. And because again, this is a private school. I wasn't sure if I don't think I made that clear. This is a private school that parents have to pay tuition for, and all these yeshivas usually charge between, depending on if there's government subsidies, in which California there definitely is not really, but in New York there are subsidies because there are so many more kids going to these schools. The tuition is anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000 a year per kid.
Yeah.
And as and most of these Orthodox families have, the ideal is to have as many kids as possible. So we can be talking hundreds of thousands of dollars for these schools.
Easily. Yeah.
Easily. And a large percentage, especially the more yeshivish you get, a large percentage of these families cannot afford to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So what ends up happening in a lot of cases is the slack kind of gets picked up by, there's always a few wealthier people in these schools, and they end up contributing and kind of picking up the slack for the people who can't really afford to pay, because it's not in Orthodox Judaism, especially like as you get more extreme, it is going to a public school or even to like I guess even modern Orthodox schools would charge tuition, and usually a lot more, in fact, because of all the emphasis they put on secular studies, and it's all private. But going to public school, like not being able to afford Jewish school is not an option. It's not like, oh, like we can't afford it, I guess we have to send you to public school. It's like we can't afford it, but like somebody in the community will help us, or like we're gonna find a way. Like we're like it's not an option to be sent to public. It's off the table. It doesn't even exist. So they make it work. Very rarely do kids not get into these schools. Usually, if the parents want it and they want it, usually a way is found. But anyway, so growing up, I was studying the Torah, and for me, I always found it to be difficult. It was in a different language. None of it really makes sense on the surface, the way it's being studied, because you start studying this stuff in first grade. I was 6 years old when I first started, reading the Bible inside and reading the Torah and actually translating the letters and everything like that. And I've never actually even done this, as in to read like an English translation of the Bible, because the whole point within this Orthodox system is that there's a lot more than what's on the surface for the Torah. Like you have to read into every word, into every letter, and come up with a million different explanations for what he really meant here and what they really meant there. And like the whole idea is that the Torah is like it contains all the secrets of the world verbatim if you just know how to look into them. But I even remember thinking as a kid, like, I'm like, this is just a bunch of stories of dudes. Like, there's no secret messages here. Like you can read into anything you want. If you want it enough, you can find secret messages in anything.
Yeah.
But even saying that out loud, it makes me feel like a heretic, honestly. Like to say that like the Torah isn't full of secret messages and like doesn't contain the wisdom of the world. Like it's such a deeply ingrained idea in me still that like even saying that out loud makes me feel a little weird. but I'm pretty sure at this point that that is the case, that there are not secret messages. Um, and yeah, the whole idea is that there's a very big depth to the study, and I mean, rabbis for thousands of years have been doing this and studying it. But that obviously doesn't lend any more validity to their claims. Just the fact that they've been doing it for a long time.
Right, right.
Uh, but they have absolutely. There's archaeological evidence for this, and we have texts that are thousands of years old and unchanged. Which is interesting to say the least. But the actual study I never found very interesting. It's in the beginning. It's just reading the I don't know how familiar you are with the Old Testament, but the way it works for most yeshivas that I'm aware of, most of the people I've spoken to, and most of the situations I know, the Old Testament has 5 books in it. You know, Genesis, Exodus, uh, Leviticus,
Deuteronomy.
And no, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy.
That's it. Yep.
Yeah. In those 5 books, the first 2, Genesis and Exodus, are the most emphasized in these yeshivas from first grade until probably third, fourth grade. So from age 6 to age around 9, 10. Pretty much all that is studied, for sure, like inside the actual book, is these first books. And over those years, you go through every line, like every sentence is learned, like with the rabbi. He goes over it, translates it. What does it mean? You get tested on it, on what it means, on what the commentaries say, on what the hidden meanings are, on all that stuff. And then going up until around age 10, 11, the focus starts to shift away from the Bible. And I'm sure they do exist, but I have not ever been aware of a yeshiva that actually finishes the entire Old Testament, like inside, like reading the book and teaching every single sentence. The reason for that is because the Genesis and Exodus stories are like the foundations of what we consider Judaism to be.
Huh.
Like the Exodus story is like one of the most important events in Jewish history, and that's what Passover is all about. The entire holiday is celebrating that. The Exodus.
Right.
And right. And so, but after so the way the story goes, like Abraham had all these sons, and he had his ancestors, and Isaac, and he had Jacob, and they had all their sons, and then the descendants of those people ended up in Egypt, and then they became slaves, and then Moses showed up and performed all the plagues, and the Pharaoh let them go, and then they went out in the Red Sea, and then he split the sea, and then they made it to the desert. Then they wandered around the desert for 40 years until God finally brought them to the promised land of Israel. And at that point, pretty much, the rest of the Torah, like the rest of those 3 books, the entire Leviticus is more or less pretty much laws of how to build the temple, like the Holy Temple. Very detailed, specific laws of how to build the temple. Like we're talking measurements and sizes, and like everything was detailed, how they built it, what they built. The book of Numbers is kind of there is interesting stuff in there, and I've had like sections of it learned, but a lot of it is also kind of more esoteric stuff about like what happened when they were in the desert, and what happened with Moses and how he was dealing with the people. Definitely not as accessible to kids, I would say.
Right.
And the final book is actually, a lot of it is actually a recap. A lot of it is a repetition of, like, the 10 Commandments were first mentioned in Exodus, but they get mentioned again in the same way in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy at the end. And then the Torah finally ends with the death of Moses and his disciple Joshua picking up where he left off and leading the Jewish people into the Holy Land. And that's where the Old Testament ends. From there, there is I don't really know the English translation for this. I'm sure it's just slipping my mind, but there is a book which there are several books which actually encompass the Old Testament as well, called the Tanakh. That is the Hebrew term for it.
Mm-hmm.
And Tanakh includes the Torah, the Bible, Nevi'im, which is the books of of the prophets. Navi literally translates the prophets. It's the books of the prophets, because after the Jews went into Israel, there was this age of the prophets, people who could supposedly communicate directly with God, which was an art which was lost. In Jewish tradition, the only person who ever spoke like face to face with God, literally the term in the Torah used is panim el panim, which means face to face, was Moses. He was the only human to ever be allowed to speak face to face with God. And even then, it wasn't literally face to face. There's a lot of commentary, but he had like conversations with God the way we're having a conversation according to tradition.
Right.
But the prophets that came after, they wouldn't speak directly with God, but they would get dreams. They would get there were certain criteria for it to be valid, but they would get it in dreams. They would get messages. So there's a lot of stories of them, and that's all encompassed in the Navi. And these books are considered just as holy and unchangeable and like word from God as the Torah is. Like these stories, even though they came way after and they were not written by God, like we understand that humans definitely wrote those books after the Torah. Their words are still considered just as holy. It's considered like all-encompassing part of the story. And those kind of include the stories of King Solomon, the stories of King David, people who did archaeologically exist, as far as we're aware. And so it kind of goes over those stories that are actually those stories actually are kind of like action movie like level. Like there is violence, there's rape, there's wars, there's infidelity. Like those are a little more interesting. Although I will say it is less interesting when you're tested on it to like the degree of a calculus exam. It becomes far less interesting.
Right.
But those are fairly interesting stories, especially when you just read them through. And then there are these they're called kind of like poems almost that were written by like King Solomon. I know some of them are like kind of known, but in Hebrew they are there's like Shir HaShirim, which means Song of Songs, which was like a song of praise that King Solomon wrote. That is like read to the congregation on certain holidays. Like all of the and most of these texts are read at certain points. Like the entire Torah gets read out of the Torah scroll every week, as well as every Monday and Thursday in the Orthodox tradition. The reason for that is because that way, the reason for Monday and Thursday is because that way they will never go more than 2 days without reading the Torah. And the way that works is everyone goes into the shul together, and they pull out the Torah scroll. And in Orthodox tradition, there is a very specific way the Torah needs to be read. There's this very specific tune which was passed down through generations. And you cannot mispronounce a word, and you can't even touch the Torah scroll itself. It's too holy. But you can't mispronounce a word, you can't mispronounce the tune, and if you do, you get corrected very loudly by the congregation. And I actually used to do that because as a bar mitzvah boy, I learned how to read it, and they used to pay me to do it because it's fairly difficult because there's no indications of what the tune is or even what the vowels are, because the way Hebrew is written is the letters have vowels underneath them that can change the sound of a letter.
Right.
And inside the actual Torah, the Torah was written before these vowels existed. So a word can be read like 3 different ways, and if you haven't practiced it over and over and over again and you do it wrong, then you'll have to like start that passage over again. So it's a lot of work to read the Torah. And so the Torah is read, the entire Torah is read every year, like every single word, everything is read every year. On Monday and Thursday, they just read a tiny section. But on Saturday, on Shabbos in Shul, that is when it takes, between half an hour to an hour, they read an entire section, like the entire story of Abraham or the entire story of Isaac, and it's week to week. And it's calculated so that every year, precisely right after Rosh Hashanah, the Torah is finished, and then it started again. And then that cycle continues. So that's how that's done. And
now, when you say that like you were asked to do this, and you said that like, you had to do it at bar mitzvahs, was that just because you were so good at it that like they brought you back to keep doing that, or was that kind of a typical thing that they would do with students that did know how to do it as well as you did.
So it's more considered it's definitely it's kind of like if you have the skill and the talent, you should use it. Like
Hmm.
but it's not an obligation by any means because the person doing the reading is fulfilling the because every Jew has the obligation to read this Torah, but the person who's doing it, there's a big concept in Judaism of fulfilling other people's obligations through your own actions. Like on Friday night when you make the kiddush and bless Shabbos to come in, only one person does that, usually the father. But everyone has the obligation. He's just fulfilling their obligation by having them in mind when he does it. So it's the same thing through the Torah.
Hmm.
I had better singing voice when I was younger, and when I was 13 for sure, and I was pretty good, and I was able to for my bar mitzvah. It's called a bar mitzvah parsha, like the section that you read. It correlates to the section that was being read that week when you were born. That's how it's picked usually. Um, and I learned it very fast, like in half the time that I was supposed to. And my dad, he got a little bit overexcited, and he's like, "Oh, you finished it so fast. Let's have you learn like a whole nother section that you can do at a different time." I'm like, "Oh, I wasn't. It was a lot of work. Like it was very difficult. And but I did whatever he asked me to do. I did it at my bar mitzvah, and then afterwards he's like, "Listen, you're so talented. You should keep doing it. Like they'll pay you." So I did it for several years. Um, it wasn't the worst experience. It's kind of like preparing for any sort of performance. It's difficult, but and it's not fun to get corrected by people in the middle, but it happens, and it wasn't a huge deal. I at some point I was just like, I this is annoying. The money is not worth it anymore. I would rather do other things.
Right. Ah, man. So that's fascinating. So what happened after all that? So you were how old at that point?
Okay, so let's paint a bit of a picture here. So I had been, just kind of following along like any 6 to 10 year old does. There isn't much autonomy in the cognition or in the physical realm. Kind of just do what you're supposed to do. Around seventh, eighth grade, around that time actually, like around my bar mitzvah, I actually started getting um, a little bit more into to Orthodox Judaism. Like I started praying for a very long time. I would try to have as much concentration as possible. Like I would offer to lead the prayer services, even though I've always kind of had stage fright. I never liked to do that, but I would offer to do it because it's honorable to do so. I was trying very hard to study, and so at this point, I'm not. I was trying to make this nuance earlier, but this is important. Uh, Around the age of 10, 11, the focus has shifted from the Torah to the Talmud study, and the study of Talmud is called Gemara in this yeshivish in Hebrew. The study of Gemara is the pinnacle. Like when you hear about like Orthodox Jews sitting and studying all day, they're not just learning like the Old Testament over and over again. They are studying the Talmud. That is the majority, and the Talmud encompasses older commentaries. It encompasses newer commentaries. They're all kind of put together on one page, and that is kind of like the blueprint for a lot of what we have today. But it's more than that. It's not because most of the stuff discussed in the Talmud is pretty outdated. Like the first thing that I remember learning in the Talmud, like it's like, okay, we're fine. Like you boys are old. Like, okay, you're ready to learn Talmud. Like it's a huge milestone in your life.
Yeah.
First thing we're learning about is if what happens if your cow gores somebody else. And what are the minutiae? Like, do you have to pay for the cow? Does he have to pay for the cow? What if the cow is crazy? What if the person jumps on your property? Like, and going probably 50 different scenarios about the cow goring somebody and what to do in that situation and how much money to pay and all this stuff. And it's written in a very difficult language as well. It's written in ancient Aramaic, which actually is not Hebrew. Like, it's a completely different language.
Yeah, yeah.
So even if you know Hebrew, which I did not, because another function of these yeshivish schools, which is incomprehensible to me. Like I still don't really understand this, but in like modern Orthodox schools, they often do teach Hebrew as like a class, but in yeshivish schools, they really do not, which is very strange considering like that is the literally the function of the entire religion is the Hebrew language. Like the Torah is written in an ancient form of Hebrew. The language of the Jews is Hebrew. Like, but these yeshiva schools, they kind of figure people will pick it up along the way, and also because they don't speak traditional like Israeli Hebrew. They speak like a mix of Aramaic and it's not really a spoken language. It's like a language used in conversation of study, and it's a combination of Aramaic, a combination of ancient Hebrew, a combination of modern Hebrew, a combination of Yiddish, a combination of English. It's definitely crazy stuff. So the language was always one of the hardest parts for me because you have all these different ancient languages, which even if I knew Hebrew, which I didn't, they would not help me very much. There's no vowels, and for Gemara, which like the Torah is a lot of like stories and like kind of more free flowing. Gemara, it's a lot of times arguments between different sages, people discussing like arguments sometimes between 4 or 5 different people on one page, and there are absolutely no grammatical indications. There's no periods, no commas, nothing. It's just a completely flowing. So you have to actually like learn what somebody is saying and like where it stops and where it ends and like what they mean, and like a lot of times they'll just say like 3 words and like the translation is like it's like ox gored the cow. It's like, and the actual what he really meant by that is like, if an ox gores a cow inside of like a certain area, then you should do this. And like you just have to learn that and know that like from the rabbi. And again, all of this is in an ancient language which people do not speak as like a conversational tongue.
So you have to read something in a language that you don't understand, and it's an interpretation of an interpretation.
Interpretation of an interpretation of an interpretation. And not only that, many times the people who are arguing, it's not like they come to conclusions. It's kind of, it can be circular sometimes. That people come to 2 different conclusions and they never say which one is right, because when these guys are discussing like the halacha, which is what the law, there is supposed to be a law, and at that time they might not have agreed on it, but Jews, like at this point, we don't really disagree on halacha. Like after the Gemara was written, Orthodox Jews, there was a rabbi, his name is slipping my mind, but this was probably in 12 to 1500 BC, I want to say. He wrote something called the Shulchan Aruch, which is what Orthodox Jews still use today as the pinnacle of the laws. Like this is like the guidebook of laws that we pull from, because the Torah itself actually is very, very vague about a lot of the laws. Like for instance, the laws of kosher. That's one of the best examples. The only thing the Torah, well, specifically within the laws of kosher, the Torah does say that you can only eat certain animals, certain fish, certain birds. But with regard to one thing, everybody knows Jews don't eat meat and milk together, right? That's like one of the central parts of keeping kosher. You can't have a cheeseburger, like you can't have any meat and milk together. So what does that actually mean? What does the Torah say about this? Well, what the Torah says, and the only thing it says about this, is do not cook a goat in its mother's milk. That is the sentence in the Torah, verbatim. Do not cook a baby goat. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So if we're going verbatim by the Torah, then I could still have a cheeseburger because that cheese came from a cow and the burger came from a cow, and that's not a goat, and it's not its mother. It wasn't cooked in its mother's milk. Hell, I could even have a goat cheeseburger with goat cheese as long as I didn't cook it in its mother's milk. But according to Orthodox Judaism, the Torah is not supposed to be taken literally. It's supposed to be interpreted, and rabbis did interpret it. And then at some point, the interpretation, it was like, okay, no more interpreting, which doesn't make sense to me either. They were like, okay, we're done. Like, this is it. Like, we figured it out. Like, why? How does that make any sense? But whatever. So
that's so exhausting, by the way.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
God.
It is.
Oh my God.
Like Orthodox Judaism is so much more intellectually intensive than I think people realize. Like
Definitely.
For Christians, like, you know what? This is perfectly. I was just thinking about this the other day, thinking if I could mention it. There's an old kind of like joke kind of story that's told in the Orthodox circles, where a young Jewish boy goes to his Christian neighbor's house to like borrow an egg or something, and he sees the Christmas tree up in the corner because it's almost Christmas.
Hmm.
And he asks the young kid, like Timmy, he asks him, uh, what's the tree for? He's like, oh, it's for Christmas. He's like, and the Jewish kid says, oh, how far away from the window does it have to be? And the kid's like, what? He's like, yeah, how tall does it have to be? Is there a certain height? What kind of tree can you use? Like, what are you allowed to hang on it? What kind of decorations can you hang on it? Are there certain decorations you can't hang on it? And the parents of the Christian parents are like, are you making fun of us? Like, what do you, like, what the hell? Like, but the kid's like, no, like for my Hanukkah candles, there's like 1,500 laws that need to be followed on how
Right.
high it can be, what candles to use, when to use it, how to use it, like anything. It's all covered.
Oh my God. Oh wow. So
I feel like that's something people don't really understand. Like, I mean, it's not common knowledge to say that. Like, it really is extremely intricate, like beyond exhausting.
well, when I went to a Christian school, I mean, we studied, the Torah and because it was the Old Testament. And we, we examined it, and we were also taught that, like, it isn't literal. Like, you're supposed to take it as not necessarily parables. Like, you're supposed to treat it as though it actually happened, but that there is a deeper meaning with every single thing. But we did not go into it to the degree that you're talking about it right now.
No, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I think a big part of that has to do with more of a focus on the New Testament.
Yes, definitely, definitely. There's no question about that. Like, it was more so just about that you can kind of ignore the Old Testament as long as
Right.
you've accepted Jesus. There's no
Which
question
which
about that.
which was also something I never really understood, to be honest, how Christians view the Old Testament, because for Jews it is like the holy book, and the New Testament is like just made up fiction, basically. But to Christians, like the Old Testament is just like old stories that happen but no longer apply because they happen to the Jews. But like if they happen to the Jews, then why would Christians care about it? Like I just never really understood it, honestly.
So the best explanation that I can give you for that is really just that they believe that Jesus was sort of like he was the culmination of all the prophecies. Like he was what all the Old Testament was calling for as what was gonna happen. So basically, like, they don't believe that everybody in the Old Testament went to hell, but they do believe that the only people in the Old Testament that went to heaven were the ones that believed that Jesus was going to be the Savior.
That is interesting, considering he wasn't going to be born for several thousand years.
Hmm.
um, and it's actually interesting. Kind of maybe a little bit off topic, but um, the characters in the Old Testament, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, these people's existence has never been independently confirmed outside of the Bible.
Right.
But Jesus has actually is mentioned inside the Talmud because he lived at the same time that the Talmud was written.
Hmm.
He is in the Talmud. They actually have a fairly extensive discussion about him. They mentioned that there is this person who claims to have performed miracles, and they go over different miracles that like can be performed, and like they say that yes, there are certain powers that can be tapped into. However, this doesn't mean that he's actually God. And they actually specifically write in there that like this is a Jew who like became a heretic and he should be cast out. Like they were not a fan of him because he was portraying himself as a god, basically, which is idolatry, which is strictly forbidden in Judaism. Right. But like they pretty much confirmed that he was a real person who did exist, and they were aware of his actions and aware of the things he was saying and doing.
Hmm.
Which cannot be said for the characters in the Old Testament, so which is interesting. There's never been any corroboration of those characters existing.
Now let me get this straight. So you're saying that in the Talmud that Jesus is one of the characters, but the Jesus in the Talmud is different from the Jesus that's in the New Testament.
So the Talmud he's not a character. The Talmud, it kind of does have characters, but they're not part of a story. It's like different sages who are well known, whose names pop up over and over again, who say like, okay, in this situation, do this and this. And sometimes the Talmud will go off into tangents where these sages will tell stories. And these stories, of course, were always taught that these stories have tons of arcane meaning and deeper meanings. But a lot of the times, these stories are insane, like crazy stories. I can't even think of any off the top of my head. But they're like fairy tale, like Brothers Grimm level stories.
Right.
Of just like insane, crazy stuff happening. And it's taught that they all have deeper meanings. They're all special stories, holy people, whatever. But Jesus was not. He was not like a sage in the Bible. It's fairly brief, like maybe one page talking about him, just mentioning that there was a Jew in the Talmud. His name is Yeshu. They mentioned that there's a guy named Yeshu who was a Jew who found some like Kabbalistic stuff and was able to perform some miracles and then fashion himself as a god. And actually, interestingly enough, these sections of the Talmud were heavily censored by Christians in the coming years. And for a brief part of Jewish history, maybe even longer than brief, I think for a fair amount of time, people just didn't even know that these sections existed. They were rediscovered later because the Christians were not happy that they were dissing their boy Jesus.
Right. And I get what you're saying. So it's like where the Torah and the Bible are sort of parables in nature, sort of like in the way that they're written. The Talmud is much more so kind of like debates between sages, between kind of Torah scholars in a way.
Precisely that.
Gotcha.
And so these, and again, these all of these books from the Torah to the Tanakh to the Talmud, pretty much ending at the Talmud, like everything after that was written by people who were like close enough to us that we like know about them and like who they were. And while their works are considered holy and immutable, it's definitely not to the same level as the Talmud or the Torah.
Right.
I'm talking about like Maimonides, for instance. Like he is like his word in many cases like is still followed today, but his books and his writings are they while they are holy, they're not considered to quite the same level as like the Talmud or the Torah would be. Yeah, and it's pretty much the Talmud is debates and stuff. And I actually remember, I believe I was in 11th grade, so it's probably like 17. We were learning a section of the Talmud, and it was a very story-heavy section. There's certain sections which is just chock full of them, not really like with specific characters that are super important, just stories, and often there's a message. Often not. Sometimes they just seem to be sitting around discussing stuff with no purpose. And I remember that there was one section which went into great detail about the sun, there were several different opinions. One of the opinions was that the world is a disk and the sun moves under it at night, and that is what creates night. This same opinion claimed that is how hot springs happen because the sun heats the hot springs up. This is just what's written in the Talmud, word for word. And I remember going to my principal and I was like, dude, like, how can we say that this is like, these guys have like divine knowledge and like their word is immutable if like they clearly had this is clearly wrong. Like the sun doesn't even go around the earth, let alone go under the earth and heat up hot springs. That's just what people thought at the time. And my principal was like, listen, like these people were holy, like they had special meanings within it, like it's not supposed to be taken literally. I'm like, I have a problem with that, like, and I remember having a very big problem with that. I was like, how can we not? I don't have a problem with the fact that they had the incorrect scientific knowledge of their time. Like, obviously, they just had whatever access they had.
Right. Yeah.
But I have a problem with the fact that it's considered so immutable and like so holy, and like this is like the main purpose of study like all day is and again like there are people who say that that they didn't have the scientific knowledge and like that's okay, like they were allowed to be wrong about scientific things, and there are people like my principal who say like no, they were never wrong, like everything they said they were fully aware of what they were saying. And they were fully aware they had like a message they wanted to impart. Like they cannot be wrong. Like it is like that. They just can't be, which doesn't make sense to me because they were humans. I'm pretty sure.
That's exactly what I was just thinking. So like it would be one thing if you were supposed to read that and as though that's just what they believed the sun was at that time, and then that's all the meaning that there is to it. They're trying to explain the universe. Like, all right, that's cool. I can appreciate that. Or I could even appreciate it as like the way that we read Greek mythology. Something that's just kind of like a metaphor for society, existence, whatever you want to call it. But instead, with this, it sounds like your teachers were actually emphasizing, looking at these stories and sometimes taking them literally and sometimes not.
Yes. So it comes down to this. If you have such a strong belief that the Torah and everything that stems from it is literally, fundamentally, and like creationist level, like facts, like everything that happened factually happened, like God wrote those words and like they are like, this is straight from God. If you truly believe that, then, the same problem you'll have with any other fundamentalist religion is that everything about that, any proof, any discussion will be viewed through the lens of, well, first this is immutable. Now let's see what we can do to fit it into this.
Yeah.
And that's the main problem with all these fundamentalist religions. If your main, you can't disprove God. So I guess everything that is in this book has to be true, and we'll just fit it in and make it to be the word of God.
Right. So what do they actually think the Torah is then? And I know that there's more to your story, with what you've experienced. But I just want to I have this question because you're talking about these other books that are interpretations or finding the hidden messages in the Torah, and
right.
But yet at the same time they are trying to say that this is. That like if they are basically creationists, like they believe that this is how the world came to be.
Yes.
So if they're both looking at it as though there's a hidden message, and they're looking at it as truth, what is it? Just that it's a constant process of trying to find whatever way you can to marry those two views.
There's a lot of that, absolutely. And again, it's very interesting to see how the study of and like the acceptance of the interpretations has become, because like today there's no rabbi in the world that can like write a new book and be like, this is like rabbis write books all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
they are just like sometimes they have their own interpretations, but nobody's taking that as holy word. Like it's just somebody's opinion about text. Basically, it's no big deal. Like sometimes rabbis who are considered very holy, and I actually want to get into that as well about how these rabbis are, some of the biggest rabbis are looked at in Orthodox Judaism, because that's also something I think people are not very aware of. But these rabbis might write a book, and people will study it as well and be like, oh wow, it's such a great opinion, but nobody's looking at that as like holy immutable words. Like it's just his interpretation of the Talmud or of whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And absolutely, Orthodox Jews are creationists. That is like what you're taught is that like the world was created in 6 days, and like it was created 5,779 years ago. That is when creation began.
Mm-hmm.
And then God created. Somehow he created plants before the sun. And then he created Adam, and then he created Eve, and then they populated the world. Like that is what is verbatim taught as fact.
Yeah.
Evolution is not taught in these yeshivas. If it is, it's taught very, very briefly, like in the secular studies, and rabbis will be quick to shut it down and be like, oh, well, you really believe in that? Like, come on, like you really think we came from monkeys? Like it's a big concept, especially as theories of evolution became evolved, and Jews kind of felt like they were under attack by evolution, especially in like the 70s and 80s when it kind of started coming to schools. And I know Christians also were dealing with this as well.
Yeah.
That evolution was starting to become perceived as an attack on the religion. I heard many times growing up, there's a famous story about a big rabbi who was on a plane, and so the story goes he was on the plane with his grandson who was helping him. And the guy sitting next to them leaned over and said, "Rabbi, I have a question for you. How come your grandson treats you so respectfully and he's so helpful with you, and my grandchildren won't even talk to me?" And the rabbi looks at him and says, "Well, because you believe that you were descended from monkeys, so every generation closer to the monkeys is less evolved. So why would your grandchildren treat you with respect? But we believe that we came from Adam, the original perfect human. So every person who's older is one step closer to that." Now, obviously, that story is like, what are you even talking about? Like, But that's kind of the idea. It's like we are not descended from monkeys. Like we are descended from perfect humans who were created in the perfect image of God, who knew exactly what God wanted and knew exactly what God spoke directly to them and gave them all the instructions, and now it's up to us to follow them. Like that is precisely how it's viewed.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like that can breed a superiority complex also.
So here's the thing. Especially like I don't want to shit too much on Orthodox Judaism as a people, because there are absolutely many great things and many great parables, many great ways to live your life, which can absolutely be taken from that. But there absolutely is a bit of a superiority complex, as in like it's like what is taught. What is taught. I'm just telling you what was taught to me as a kid. Like that's all I'm telling you is that God, when after we left Egypt, after the Jews left Egypt, they were wandering in the desert, and God, as the story goes, God offered the Torah to every nation in the world, and every nation in the world refused it because God would tell them what was in it. They'd say, "What's in this book that you're offering to us?" And God would say, "Well, it says don't murder," and they would say, "Don't murder? What? We can't have that," and et cetera, whatever. And then eventually got to the Jews, and the Jews didn't even question what was in it. They just said, "Yes, we're going to do it," which, like, that's not something I would hold up as like as an ideal, to just accept things without knowing what's in them. But it absolutely is held up as an ideal, and because of that, because the Jews didn't question, they just said, "Yes, absolutely, we'll listen, we'll do whatever you say." Because of that, they are the chosen people, and the Torah was given to them, and they are special. Um, and which is not like, if you want to believe that, that's fine, but there absolutely is a lot, and again, the less you interact with society as a Jew, the more of this you'll see. So the more Orthodox you are, the less interaction there is with society, the less interaction there is with media, with popular culture, with anybody. It's tried to be as segregated as possible, even going to the extremes of like literally living in their own communities, with 95% of the people there being Jewish. And in those communities, there is definitely a fair amount of racism, a fair amount of superiority complex, a fair amount of like, oh, like look at those, those goyim, they don't know what they're doing with their life. Like there is a fair amount of that. And a lot of it is to kind of, from my view, it's to like, to keep people in Judaism, not necessarily so much to like denigrate non-Jews. It's kind of like to say like, we're so special, like why would you not want to be special? It's not so much as like Jews, like it's discussed that Jews are like a small nation, like they were never supposed to be like the ruling power of the world. They were always within the Torah mindset meant to be like there's the other nations of the world and then there's the Jews. And that's still how it's taught today. And there definitely is a bit of a complex and a bit of certain things which I would like to see not there if possible.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about it as far as like stereotypes or anything like that goes. I just mean like if I were told when I was younger that like I'm the chosen one, and then like I needed to, tell everybody that, I can't have been descended from apes because I was, because God chose me. I mean, I would have a big head on my shoulders for most of my, young adult life. You know what I mean? Like that's, right. I feel like that would, it has the potential for that, but yeah, absolutely. Man, I mean, that's I had no idea that that it actually does for many people. I mean, that's just to the point of segregating themselves from the rest of society or even each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's kind of interesting. One of the tenets also as well of Jewish faith is that God gave the Torah to the Jews on Mount Sinai. Like that's a pretty well known thing, that like Mount Sinai is where the Torah was given. But what does this actually mean? So what we're taught is that Moses went up to the mountain. God gave him the 10 Commandments. He carved them into rocks, like the tabernacles. Moses brought them back down. The Jews were already worshiping idols because they couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes at a time. Moses got pissed off that they're worshiping idols, broke the tabernacles. A bunch of Jews died and were punished for that. And then they got a second chance. Moses went back up, got another set of tabernacles. And while he was up there the second time, tradition is that God wrote the Torah with him. Like Moses wrote the book physically, but God put every word in his head. Like God told him exactly every word to write. And there are different theories actually, because the end of the Torah writes about his death, and they're like, did he have to write about his own death? And like some people say no, some people say yes. But either way, and when he and the most important thing is when he came back down the second time, there was this thing where the voice of God literally came from the mountain, and supposedly there were millions of Jews there who all saw and heard like thunder and lightning and like massive explosions as the word of God spoke like the Ten Commandments to them, literally like a voice from heaven. And this is one of the fundamental arguments actually for Judaism being true, because they say it's actually from an ancient text called the Kuzari, and the Kuzari claimed, he was a person and his text is just named after him, and what he claimed is that if you had millions of people at a mountain claiming that the voice of God spoke to them, you couldn't fake that, right? And all these people tell their children, like, I was there and I saw it, and they all tell their children, my parents were there and they saw it, like, how could you fake that? Obviously it must be true. There are many, many, many flaws with that argument, not the least of which that pretty much everybody at that time was incredibly gullible and attributed meaning to many, many things which had absolutely no meaning. And you know, and there's never been any archaeological evidence found for Jews even wandering through the desert. They've never found Mount Sinai exactly where it is. They're unable to determine its exact location. A lot of issues, but that is also considered one of the cores of Jewish belief. And more than that, what I was taught and what Orthodox Jews are taught is that it's not just that your ancestors were there. You were there. Every Jew. It's almost like Stockholm syndroming into you something that happened 3,000 years ago. Like, you were there. Like, no, you were there. You remember it. Like, your spirit was there. Like, that's literally told to you like that. Like, no, I was there. You were there. Like, you can't deny this. I'm like, but I wasn't there, dude. Like, what do you mean? It's like, no, but you were. Your spirit was there. Like, you absolutely were. And that's always something that it never sat well with me. I'm like, dude, I know I wasn't there. Like, I don't give a fuck what my spirit was doing. Like, dog.
Yeah.
You know, so that never sat well with me. As an argument for Judaism being true.
This concludes part 1. In the next episode, Isaac continues his story chronologically, and we get into topics of sex education and gender separation. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a written review with 5 stars. Most importantly, share the show with someone you trust.